Hey guys, tonight we're taking a truly mind-bending dive, not into the dusty ledgers of forgotten monarchs, or the grim realities of peasant toil, though we'll brush against them, believe me, but into a fascinating, often misunderstood, and surprisingly prevalent aspect of medieval life: the surprising experiences of getting high in medieval times. This was a world where altered states of consciousness were not some counterculture phenomenon. They were often woven directly into the very fabric of daily existence, driven by a desperate need for pain relief, the intense yearning for spiritual transcendence, the primal desire for social bonding, and sometimes simply finding a way to cope with the sheer, unremitting misery and boredom of a truly harsh life. So, before you imagine medieval raves, which, let's be honest, were probably more like very confused, highly volatile church services, or perhaps a particularly rowdy village feast that went off the rails, consider giving a like and subscribing. Only, of course, if you're ready to explore how alcohol was often considered a health drink, how poppies were the absolute gold standard for pain relief, and how a seemingly innocent piece of rye bread could literally send you on a terrifying, demon-haunted trip you never asked for. Let me know where you're joining us from. It's always fascinating to see who's out there, across the globe, perhaps enjoying a completely legal, non-hallucinogenic beverage, safe in the knowledge that their morning toast isn't going to induce visions of hellfire. Now, dim the lights. Perhaps put on some ethereal, slightly spooky Gregorian chant or a medieval jig, depending on your preferred altered state. And let's ease into tonight's truly mind-bending, often unsettling, and ultimately illuminating journey together. Prepare yourselves for the surprising truth about medieval highs, which were frequently far less fun, and far more terrifyingly spiritual than any modern experience. Imagine, for a moment, your average medieval person, whether they were a hard-scrapple peasant, a bustling merchant, or even a pampered by comparison noble. Their lives were, as we've exhaustively covered in previous dispatches, often brutal, short, and profoundly painful. Chronic aches from relentless physical labor, the constant threat of disease, the gnawing anxiety of famine, the occasional violence, and the sheer unyielding boredom of a world without electricity or endless entertainment options. These were the daily companions. So, the desire for altered states of consciousness wasn't necessarily about partying in the hedonistic sense we understand today, or even about a quest for abstract personal insight. It was deeply pragmatic. It was about pain relief, spiritual transcendence, social bonding, and sometimes simply finding a way to cope with the sheer, unremitting misery of existence. This was a world utterly devoid of designated drug dealers, or clandestine underground raves with glow sticks and techno beats. Instead, it was a murky, dangerous landscape where the lines between medicine, ritual, accidental poisoning, and mind alteration were profoundly, dangerously blurred, often with tragic, terrifying consequences for the unwary or the desperate. Every plant, every brewed concoction, every strange fungus could hold the key to either temporary solace or an agonizing journey to the grave. This wasn't just a casual beverage, it was a fundamental staple of the medieval diet, often deemed safer than the local water supply. Forget your modern puritanical notions of just saying no, or even the idea of a clear, crisp glass of H2O, in a world rife with contaminated wells, stagnant ponds, and non-existent sanitation. Plain water was often a vector for debilitating, even fatal, diseases like dysentery. Instead, ale and mead, a fermented honey drink, were the hydration of choice for everyone, from children, yes, seriously, children, to adults throughout the entire day. Imagine starting your day with a tankard of weak ale at breakfast, having more at lunch, quenching your thirst during strenuous labor with more, and finishing the day with several more. These beverages were typically brewed weak, certainly not the potent IPAs or craft beers of today, but they were consumed in truly vast quantities by all social strata. Drunkenness, while certainly frowned upon by the church, which was always ready to condemn gluttony and excess, especially among the lower classes, was also a common, almost accepted part of life. The experience of being perpetually slightly buzzed or fully inebriated was less about a psychedelic journey of self-discovery, and more about a dulling of the senses, a loosening of inhibitions, and a pervasive, low-level buzz that helped make the relentless toil, the constant discomfort, the aching muscles, and the general misery of peasant existence slightly more bearable. It provided a crude, unreliable form of pain relief, a temporary mental escape from hardship, and a potent social lubricant for communal gatherings, feasts, and festivals. Wine, for those who could afford it, which usually meant the wealthier classes, particularly in wine-producing regions, offered a more refined, if often equally potent, intoxication. The goal, for many, wasn't about seeking enlightenment or profound insight. It was about seeking oblivion, even just for a few precious hours, a temporary reprieve from the relentless grind. It was a societal anesthetic, an ever-present, culturally sanctioned method of coping that blurred the lines between nourishment and intoxication, making it truly one of the most widespread, if unacknowledged, highs of the era. The hangover, of course, was an equally pervasive reality, a cruel reminder of the brevity of escape. We've just dipped our toes into the ever-present medieval buzz of ale and mead, understanding how alcohol wasn't just a casual drink, but a crucial coping mechanism and a social lubricant in a truly tough world. We've seen how pervasive, if low-level, intoxication was often the norm, a dulling of the senses to make unrelenting hardship a tad more bearable. But the medieval world, ever full of surprises and profound desperation, had far more potent substances in its toolkit. Substances that pushed the boundaries of pain relief, spiritual seeking, and even accidental terror. Tonight, we're moving beyond the beer barrel and the wineskin, and venturing into the darker, more pharmacologically serious realm of ancient botanicals. We'll explore the widespread, yet dangerous, use of opium for profound pain relief and sedation, and the subtle, often overlooked presence of cannabis, a plant primarily cultivated for its vital fibers, but with psychoactive secrets known to many. So, before you dismiss medieval people as entirely unsophisticated in their quest for altered states, or assume their knowledge of plant medicine was primitive, consider giving a like and subscribing. Only, of course, if you're ready to uncover the surprising efficacy and profound risks of ancient plant-based medicine, and the dangerously blurred lines between utility, spirituality, and outright intoxication. Let me know where you're joining us from. It's always fascinating to see who's out there, perhaps completely unaware of the mind-bending potential of their own garden weeds. Now, dim the lights, perhaps imagine the sweet, slightly sickly scent of poppies blooming in a sun-drenched field, and let's ease into tonight's deeper, more potent journey together. Prepare yourselves for a world where powerful relief came hand in hand with profound, life-altering risks. Beyond the comforting, if inebriating, ubiquity of alcohol, the medieval world also possessed a far more potent, and in many ways, far more dangerous substance. Opium, derived directly from the humble yet powerful poppy plant. Imagine a medieval physician, perhaps an Arab scholar whose sophisticated medical texts had made their way to European monastic libraries, or a skilled village wise woman, a cunning herbalist with generations of empirical knowledge passed down through oral tradition, carefully cultivating poppy fields in their medicinal gardens, or meticulously preparing a poppy-based tincture, a soothing syrup, or a powerful draught. Opium was used for everything from the chronic, debilitating aches of old age and the relentless physical labour that defined most medieval lives, to the excruciating agony of childbirth, the searing pain of battle wounds, the torment of kidney stones, and the persistent discomfort of various diseases that offered no other respite. The high associated with opium in this medicinal context was almost always secondary to its primary therapeutic effects. A profound sense of calm, a soothing detachment from physical suffering, a warm, pervasive drowsiness, and a deep, often irresistible sedation that could lull even the most tormented soul into a dreamlike state. For many, it wasn't about seeking hedonistic pleasure. It was about seeking oblivion, a temporary, blessed escape from a reality defined by pain. Imagine the immense relief it would have offered to someone suffering from a compound fracture, a cancerous tumour, or the lingering septic pain of a traumatic injury. For them, opium was nothing short of a miracle. A temporary reprieve from a world where pain was an everyday, inescapable companion. However, the power of opium came with significant, terrifying risks. Recreational use of opium, while certainly not unheard of in certain circles, or for those truly desperate for escape, was definitely not widespread in the same manner as alcohol consumption. This wasn't something you'd casually share at the tavern after a hard day's work. Its potent effects meant that the dangers of overdose were ever present and deadly. Without precise measurement, without standardized preparations, and with individual tolerance varying wildly, consuming too much could easily lead to respiratory depression, coma, and ultimately, death. Addiction, while not understood in modern pharmacological terms, was implicitly recognized through the profound reliance some individuals developed. Those who regularly took opium for chronic conditions would undoubtedly have experienced withdrawal symptoms if their supply was interrupted. Access to pure, potent opium was limited, often controlled by apothecaries, skilled herbalists, or monastic infirmaries, making it a valuable, carefully guarded and often expensive substance, not freely available to the common peasant. The moral framework surrounding its use was complex. Viewed as a powerful medicine, its use for healing was generally accepted, but its non-medicinal use likely carried a stigma, though less publicly condemned than outright drunkenness due to its more controlled access. Its presence in medieval medicine highlights a surprisingly sophisticated, if empirically dangerous, understanding of plant chemistry for the purpose of alleviating human suffering, a constant tightrope walk between life-saving relief and deadly poison. While primarily cultivated throughout medieval Europe for its incredibly useful and versatile fibres, think the sturdy ropes that bound ships and pulled ploughs, the coarse cloth for peasant garments and sacks, strong paper, and even lamp wicks. There's compelling historical and archaeological evidence to suggest that its psychoactive properties were also known, particularly in certain regions and specific cultural contexts. Imagine a peasant cultivating a field of hemp, an utterly vital crop for their livelihood, yet perhaps also quietly aware of the subtle effects that could be gleaned from its less fibrous parts. Evidence of cannabis use, often subtle, can be found in various historical records, obscure medical texts, and through archaeobotanical analysis, sometimes pointing to its incidental ingestion or its deliberate use in specific funerary rituals or as a folk remedy. Medieval hemp strains were generally lower in THC, meaning the experience was probably closer to a gentle relaxation, a subtle shift in perception, a mild feeling of well-being, or perhaps an increased appreciation for flavors and sounds rather than a full-blown psychedelic or intensely euphoric experience. It was less about overwhelming intoxication and more about a gentle, almost imperceptible easing of tension, a softening of the edges of a harsh reality. So, how might medieval people have consumed it? Cannabis seeds were commonly consumed as a nutritional supplement, added to pottage or baked into bread, providing valuable protein and fats. It's entirely plausible that some of the psychoactive compounds might have been incidentally ingested this way, leading to a subtle, low-level buzz without conscious intent. Beyond seeds, the leaves and flowering tops of the plant contain more potent compounds. While smoking cannabis in pipes became more widespread later after the introduction of tobacco pipes from the Americas, there's limited, though not absent, evidence of earlier forms of inhalation, perhaps through burning dried plant material as incense in specific rituals, particularly in areas with older pagan traditions or cultural exchange with the East. The context of its psychoactive use was varied. In folk medicine, cannabis might have been used to alleviate pain, aid digestion, reduce anxiety, or as a mild sleep aid effects consistent with its lower THC profile. In more remote, pagan-influenced areas, or where cultural exchange with Eurasian shamanic traditions was present, it might have been used ritually by shamans or spiritual healers to induce mild trance states or aid divination. However, the evidence for widespread casual recreational smoking or eating of cannabis across Western Europe is scattered and often open to interpretation, certainly not as overt or pervasive as alcohol or opium. The bedmaker, perhaps preparing mattresses from hemp fibers, or a peasant finding solace from aching muscles after a long day in the fields, might have inadvertently or intentionally, but discreetly, partaken in its subtle effects, adding another layer to the complex tapestry of medieval consciousness alteration. It represents a more subtle, less understood aspect of how medieval people interacted with their botanical world, often finding utility and unexpected gentle side effects in the very plants that sustained them. We've navigated the comforting haze of medieval ale and the potent, yet controlled, power of poppy-derived opium. We've even considered the subtle, fibrous whispers of cannabis in the historical record. But now, my friends, we're venturing into the truly terrifying, the genuinely unwelcome, and the profoundly disturbing realm of medieval highs. Tonight, we're shining a spotlight on ergotism, the horrifying St. Anthony's fire caused by contaminated rye, and the perilous, often fatal, delirium induced by highly toxic plants like belladonna, henbane, and mandrake. Because in a world where food safety was non-existent and pharmacology was based on trial and error, a meal could become a nightmare, and a medicine could easily turn into a poison, sending you on a trip straight to hell, whether you wanted it or not. So, before you grab that organic rye bread from your pantry, perhaps hit that like button and subscribe. Only, of course, if you're prepared to witness the truly dark side of medieval mind alteration, where visions were torment and survival was a coin toss. Let me know where you're joining us from. It's always fascinating to see who's out there, safe from the accidental psychedelia of your daily bread. Now, dim the lights, imagine the chilling screams of delirium, and let's ease into tonight's truly harrowing journey together. Prepare yourselves for the grim truth that some medieval highs were less a choice and more a terrifying sentence. Imagine, for a moment, the foundational staple of the medieval peasant's diet, rye bread. Coarse, dense, often stale, but utterly vital for survival. Now, imagine that bread, not just plain but infected with a sinister, invisible enemy, ergot claviceps purpurea. This wasn't something people sought out for kicks. It was an accidental, horrifying byproduct of contaminated grain, particularly rye, which was a primary crop in many parts of Europe. Consuming bread made from ergot-infected rye led to a truly terrifying condition known as ergotism, or, more chillingly, St. Anthony's fire. This was not a subtle buzz, this was a prolonged, agonizing journey into hell on earth, often leading to death or permanent disability. Ergotism manifested in two primary, equally horrifying forms. The first was gangrenous ergotism. Imagine, after weeks of unknowingly eating bread made from tainted grain, slowly succumbing to its insidious effects. It began with an excruciating burning sensation in the limbs, as if your blood itself was boiling, hence the St. Anthony's fire moniker, often associated with the agonizing skin lesions and necrosis it caused. This was followed by restricted blood flow, leading to agonizing pain, the blackening and shriveling of extremities, and eventually the horrifying, irreversible loss of fingers, toes, hands or feet due to gangrene. Imagine the screams, the desperate pleas for relief, the sight of your own flesh literally rotting and falling off while you were still alive and conscious. It was a slow, agonizing death, or a life forever marred by disfigurement, a living testament to an unseen poison. The second form, equally terrifying for its psychological torment, was convulsive ergotism. This variant specifically targeted the nervous system, triggering violent, often uncontrollable muscle spasms, contortions, and agonizing convulsions. Victims would experience intense itching, the sensation of crawling insects beneath their skin, and profoundly disturbing delirium. And crucially for our topic tonight, convulsive ergotism-induced vivid, often terrifying hallucinations. Imagine vividly seeing grotesque demons, radiant angels, or terrifying monsters, hearing disembodied voices, and feeling your body distort into monstrous shapes, all while your limbs were twitching, burning, or convulsing uncontrollably. These weren't fun trips. Sought out for entertainment, they were prolonged, agonizing nightmares, often leading to madness, death, or severe permanent neurological damage. For the medieval mind, utterly lacking a scientific explanation for such widespread terrifying phenomena, these experiences were terrifyingly real. They weren't seen as a disease caused by a fungus. They were interpreted as divine punishment for communal sin, direct demonic possession, or the malevolent work of witchcraft. Entire villages, sometimes even regions, could be affected, leading to mass hysteria, profound fear, and desperate pleas for miraculous intervention, all caused by a microscopic fungus on their daily bread. Imagine the sheer psychological burden of knowing that your very sustenance could turn into an engine of hellish visions and agonizing bodily decay. It was the ultimate, involuntary, bad trip, inflicted by your main food source, a brutal reminder of humanity's vulnerability in a world of unknown dangers. Beyond the accidental horrors of ergot, there were other plants known to the medieval world, used often with extreme caution due to their high toxicity, to induce profound altered states. These were not for casual consumption. They were powerful substances, blurring the lines between medicine, magic, and outright poison. Key among these were belladonna, deadly nightshade, henbane, and mandrake. Consuming these, even in seemingly small amounts, could induce a terrifying array of effects: profound delirium, vivid and often frightening hallucinations, both visual and auditory, drastically blurred vision, a parched dry mouth, dilated pupils, giving a mad look, and a profound sense of dissociation from reality. Imagine a medieval alchemist, a cunning wise woman in a remote village, or even a desperate medical practitioner, preparing these substances. They were used, in extremely small, precisely controlled, though often inaccurately measured doses, as crude anesthetics for minor surgeries, though often with terrifying side effects, to numb pain, or as powerful sedatives. The high, from these plants, was almost invariably a terrifying journey into delirium, characterized by a feeling of weightlessness or flying, which some scholars link directly to medieval witchcraft accusations, where witches claimed to fly on broomsticks or attend sabbats after applying specific psychoactive ointments derived from these plants to their skin. Victims might experience a profound sense of confusion, paranoia, and the inability to distinguish reality from their terrifying visions. It was a deeply unreliable and incredibly dangerous path to altered consciousness, a perilous dance with death, where the difference between a vision and a fatal seizure was a matter of a tiny, immeasurable dose. These were not for casual experimentation. They were powerful, feared substances, respected for their potential, but understood to be profoundly dangerous. Their use underscores the medieval desperation for effective medicine and the willingness to risk horrifying consequences for even a slim chance of relief or a glimpse into the unseen. The common thread through all these medieval experiences of getting high, whether accidental or intentionally sought, was a profound lack of scientific understanding, a constant, palpable sense of danger, and an often spiritual or medicinal intent, rather than purely recreational fun. There was no concept of precise dosage control, no understanding of toxicology, and certainly no harm reduction strategies or emergency services to call if a trip went wrong. The high was frequently unpleasant, terrifying, or directly linked to profound physical suffering and potential death. It was a testament to the desperate, persistent human desire to escape pain, to connect with the divine or the demonic, or to simply find fleeting solace in a brutal, confusing world, even if that meant dancing with delirium or teetering on the absolute edge of death. Their altered states were often thrust upon them by contaminated food, or sought out through perilous, poorly understood botanical means, a gamble with their very souls and bodies. From the widespread dulling effects of weak ale to the horrifying involuntary trips of ergotism and the perilous delirium induced by highly toxic plants, these altered states were deeply woven into the fabric of medieval existence, reflecting a world where the boundaries of health, magic, and survival were always blurred and often deadly. And that, my friends, is a reality that makes us truly appreciate our safe, legal, and mostly predictable pharmaceutical options, and perhaps a healthy respect for what our ancestors risked to simply feel something other than pain, or to glimpse something beyond their harsh daily grind. We've navigated the comforting haze of medieval ale and the potent, yet controlled, power of poppy-derived opium. We've even considered the subtle, fibrous whispers of cannabis in the historical record, acknowledging that even utility plants had their secrets. But now, my friends, as our journey through medieval altered states deepens, we must venture into realms less about direct consumption and more about the strange, often terrifying interplay of botany, ritual, and desperate human seeking. Tonight, we're shining a spotlight on hallucinogenic fungi, particularly the iconic fly agaric and the mind-altering power of ritualistic fumes and sensory manipulation. So, before you eye that mushroom growing in your backyard with newfound suspicion, or think about burning a little too much incense, consider giving a like and subscribing. Only, of course, if you're prepared to witness the truly primal, often unpredictable, and sometimes profoundly spiritual, or terrifyingly demonic, methods of medieval mind alteration. Let me know where you're joining us from. It's always fascinating to see who's out there, perhaps completely unaware of the mind-bending potential of their own local flora. Now, dim the lights, perhaps put on some truly ethereal, slightly unsettling music, and let's ease into tonight's truly profound and often dangerous journey together. Prepare yourselves for a world where fungi offered visions and smoke could carry you to another plane. Imagine, if you will, the deep, mysterious, often fear-inducing forests that still cloaked much of medieval Europe. Within these ancient woods, a creature of vibrant, almost fairy tale beauty could be found, yet it held the potential for profound, disorienting visions. Hallucinogenic fungi, most notably the iconic fly agaric, Amanita muscaria. While not as universally consumed as alcohol or opium, anthropological and ethnobotanical studies, combined with scattered historical references, strongly suggest its use in specific Northern European and Eurasian cultures, particularly in contexts influenced by older shamanistic or pagan practices that predated or coexisted with Christianity. They understood, through generations of empirical and often perilous experimentation, how to prepare and consume them, often after drying to alter their chemical composition, and sometimes even by consuming the urine of an animal that had ingested them, a crude but effective detoxification method. The high, induced by fly agaric, was typically far from pleasant or purely recreational. It often involved vivid, often disorienting hallucinations, a distorted sense of size and perception. Objects could appear to shrink or swell dramatically, a profound feeling of euphoria followed by periods of intense nausea, muscle spasms, sweating, and confusion. Users might experience a sense of flying or a distorted connection to the natural world, a feeling of their body expanding or contracting. This was not a subtle shift in consciousness, it was a powerful, unpredictable, and often deeply unsettling journey. The context of its use was almost always ritualistic and spiritual, not casual entertainment. These fungi were considered tools for spiritual exploration, a direct, if terrifying, attempt to commune with the unseen world, to seek guidance from spirits, or to diagnose and heal the sick. The trip was usually guided by experienced practitioners who understood its unpredictable and often unpleasant nature, helping to interpret the visions for the community. For the uninitiated, or those who consumed too much, the experience could be a terrifying descent into madness, physical illness, or even death, due to its inherent toxicity. The medieval mind, encountering such profound alterations of reality, would have undoubtedly interpreted these visions as literal encounters with spirits, demons, or divine beings, reinforcing the belief in a world teeming with unseen forces. The bedmaker, perhaps a peripheral observer in a village touched by these practices, would have heard the hushed tales, further weaving the mystical into their daily fear of the unknown. It highlights a primal human desire to push beyond the veil of ordinary perception, even at immense personal risk, seeking answers or solace in the very depths of the forest. But the quest for altered states wasn't just about what grew on the ground, it was also about what filled the air. We often overlook the profound impact of ritualistic fumes and incense in enclosed, poorly ventilated medieval spaces. Imagine the interior of a medieval church, especially during an important mass, or a pagan ritual performed deep within a forest clearing. The air would be thick with the smoke from burning frankincense, myrrh, or other aromatic resins and herbs. These weren't just for peasant scent, they held profound symbolic and, often, subtle psychoactive properties. Frankincense and myrrh, for example, contain compounds that, when burned, can have mild anxiolytic, anxiety-reducing and mood-elevating effects, particularly when combined with deep breathing and prolonged exposure in a confined space. While not intentional, getting high, the constant inhalation of wood smoke, especially from certain types of wood or burning organic matter, could certainly induce states of lightheadedness, drowsiness, and a subtle detachment from reality due to carbon monoxide exposure and other volatile compounds. This was less a direct high and more a chronic, low-level intoxication that blurred the edges of daily perception, making the lines between wakefulness and dream, reality and hallucination, already thin for the medieval mind, even more permeable. In ritualistic contexts, particularly during long hours of prayer, chanting, or meditation in churches or monastic cells, the combination of rhythmic sound, fasting or physical exertion, and the constant inhalation of incense could induce powerful trance-like states. Imagine a monk, deep in prayer, surrounded by swirling incense smoke, slowly entering a state of spiritual ecstasy or profound visionary experience. These weren't considered drug-induced states, they were seen as direct communion with the divine, facilitated by ritual and atmosphere. The smoke served as a physical manifestation of prayer ascending to heaven, but also a physiological aid to alter consciousness. In more pagan or folk magic rituals, specific herbs might have been burned to summon spirits, induce prophetic visions, or prepare for healing rites, with the smoke acting as a direct pathway to altered perception. The bedmaker, in a noble household, might routinely burn incense in the bedchamber, not just for scent, but perhaps for its perceived calming properties, or to ward off evil spirits, unknowingly playing a role in the subtle alteration of their master's mental state. The common thread through all these medieval experiences of getting high, whether accidental, intentionally sought through risky plants, or subtly induced through ritual and environment, was a profound lack of scientific understanding, a constant, palpable sense of danger, and an often spiritual or medicinal intent rather than purely recreational fun. There was no concept of precise dosage control, no understanding of toxicology, and certainly no harm reduction strategies or emergency services to call if a trip went profoundly wrong. The high was frequently unpleasant, terrifying, unpredictable, or directly linked to profound physical suffering and potential death. It was a testament to the desperate, persistent human desire to escape pain, to connect with the divine or the demonic, or to simply find fleeting solace in a brutal, confusing world, even if that meant dancing with delirium or teetering on the absolute edge of death. Their altered states were often thrust upon them by contaminated food, or sought out through perilous, poorly understood botanical means, a gamble with their very souls and bodies. The pursuit of altered consciousness in the medieval era was less about modern indulgence and more about a profound, often desperate quest for meaning, relief, or a glimpse beyond the relentless grind of their earthly existence. But now, my friends, as our journey continues through the altered landscapes of the medieval mind, we must pivot from the substances themselves to the social and cultural contexts surrounding their use, the laws and taboos that governed them, or didn't, and the ways in which medieval society attempted to categorize, explain, and control these powerful, often unpredictable states of consciousness. because how a society views its highs tells us as much about its values and fears as any other aspect of its daily life. So, before you consider lighting up any questionable medieval incense, consider giving a like and subscribing. Only, of course, if you're ready to unravel the complex web of moral judgment, legal control, and profound cultural acceptance that shaped medieval experiences with altered states. Let me know where you're joining us from. It's always fascinating to see who's out there, across the globe, in their own unique social contexts. Now, dim the lights, imagine the hushed whispers of illicit knowledge and the stern pronouncements of authority, and let's ease into tonight's truly revealing journey together. Prepare yourselves for a world where getting high was rarely a simple recreational choice, but always a moral and social statement. Imagine, for a moment, the vast, overarching influence of the medieval church, the undisputed moral compass, and, often, the legislative body of the era. The church's stance on altered states was, perhaps unsurprisingly, complex and often contradictory, deeply influenced by theological doctrine, fear of paganism, and practical concerns. When it came to alcohol, the most pervasive mind-altering substance, the church's position was nuanced. While outright drunkenness was consistently condemned as a sin of gluttony and excess, particularly for priests and the lower classes, the moderate consumption of ale and wine was not only tolerated but often actively encouraged. Wine, after all, was central to the sacrament of communion, a holy symbol, and monastic orders were often skilled brewers and vintners themselves. The high from alcohol was generally understood and accepted as a natural, if sometimes problematic, part of life, a temporary dulling of the senses rather than a truly otherworldly experience. The condemnation was directed at the excess, the loss of self-control, not the substance itself. This pragmatic acceptance reflected alcohol's vital role in medieval society, as both a safer drink than water and a social bonding agent. However, when it came to substances that induced more profound, visionary, or unpredictable altered states, like the hallucinogenic plants we discussed, or the terrifying effects of ergot, the Church's reaction was far more severe, driven by deep-seated theological fears. Visions and altered perceptions, if not clearly attributable to fasting, prayer, or divine intervention, and carefully vetted by religious authorities, were often immediately attributed to demonic influence, witchcraft, or heresy. Imagine a peasant experiencing terrifying ergot-induced hallucinations. To the Church, this was not a medical condition but a spiritual battle, a sign of the devil's presence or punishment for sin. Herbalists or cunning folk who utilized potent psychoactive plants for healing or divination rituals often operated in a dangerous grey area, constantly under suspicion. Their practices could easily be conflated with sorcery, risking accusation, trial, and a gruesome end. The Church, in its zealous effort to maintain spiritual control and eradicate pagan remnants, actively sought to demonize any experience that lay outside its carefully defined spiritual pathways, turning what might have been folk medicine or spiritual exploration into dangerous, damnable acts. The high from these substances, especially if it was a profound vision, was not a personal journey, but a public declaration of your spiritual alignment, and you better hope it was aligned with the Almighty. Beyond the Church, secular authorities also had their own, often less theological, concerns, particularly regarding public order and control. While the widespread consumption of alcohol was tolerated, public disorder stemming from drunkenness could lead to fines, public shaming, or even time in the stocks. Laws might exist to regulate the brewing and sale of ale, ensuring quality and taxation. However, for most other psychoactive substances, direct legal control in the modern sense was relatively undeveloped. There were no specific drug laws, as we understand them, largely because the substances were often integrated into medicine or folk practices, and their psychoactive properties weren't always isolated or fully understood as distinct from their therapeutic uses. Instead, the control came implicitly through the Church's moral condemnations, or through the fear of being accused of witchcraft, if your use of certain plants seemed to stray into unnatural territory. Imagine a village where a sudden outbreak of ergotism might lead to a witch hunt, as terrified villagers sought a human explanation for their collective hallucination and agony, rather than a fungal one. The laws were less about the substances and more about the consequences: disorder, heresy, or perceived malevolence. This brings us to the fascinating phenomenon of unwitting or accidental highs and how society tried to explain them. For centuries, before the link between the fungus and the illness was understood, entire communities suffered from its terrifying effects. Imagine the profound fear and confusion. Why were people convulsing, seeing demons, and losing their limbs? To the medieval mind, lacking any knowledge of mycology, the only logical explanations were supernatural. It was a sign of divine wrath, a mass possession, or the work of a powerful witch. These outbreaks often led to desperate religious rituals, processions, and prayers to saints, like St. Anti, who gave the disease its name. Desperate attempts to appease God or exorcise demons. They could also fuel witch hunts, as terrified villagers sought a human scapegoat for the inexplicable suffering. The high. Here was a terrifying, involuntary journey into a shared psychosis, a nightmare inflicted by the very bread that sustained them, profoundly shaping their understanding of good, evil, and the unseen forces at play in their world. The bedmaker, seeing a child writhe with St. Anthony's fire in the very bed they prepared, would have attributed it to unseen evil, not mouldy rye. Furthermore, we must consider the medieval understanding of addiction and its social perception. While modern pharmacology and psychology hadn't developed the concept of chemical dependency, the visible effects of habitual, heavy alcohol consumption, or the profound reliance on opium for chronic pain, were certainly observed. A chronic drunkard might be socially ostracized, condemned by the church, and viewed as a moral failure rather than someone suffering from an illness. A person heavily reliant on opium for pain might be seen as weakened, dependent, or even morally compromised. The social safety nets were non-existent, so chronic addiction would often lead to destitution, as the affected individual became unable to work and contribute to the communal survival. There was little sympathy for those who fell into such states, only judgment and condemnation, further isolating those already suffering. This highlights a profound gap in understanding, where biological and psychological conditions were often framed purely as moral failings, leading to severe social consequences for those experiencing involuntary dependency. Finally, we must acknowledge that for all the dangers and condemnations, the medieval quest for altered states, however accidental or perilous, often sprang from a place of profound human need. In a world of ubiquitous pain, pervasive fear, and ceaseless physical toil, the desire for even a temporary respite, a glimpse of transcendence, or a moment of oblivion was powerful. Alcohol provided a dulling comfort, opium offered true pain relief, and even the terrifying visions induced by ergot or toxic plants might, in a twisted way, offer a sense of experiencing something more than the brutal daily grind. These experiences, whether sought or inflicted, were deeply woven into the fabric of medieval life, reflecting a complex interplay of survival, spirituality, and a desperate, often dangerous human curiosity about the limits of perception. They were not just about getting high, they were about coping, about believing, and about finding some form of meaning or escape in a truly bewildering world. So, the social and cultural contexts of medieval highs reveal a nuanced, often contradictory picture. Alcohol was a tolerated constant, opium, a feared medicine, and hallucinogens, a gateway to either divine communion or demonic damnation. And that, my friends, is a reality that makes our own debates about recreational substances seem rather tame, confined as they are to a world with far fewer accidental demons in our bread. We've ventured deep into the medieval pharmacopoeia, charting the roles of wise women, apothecaries, and clergy in dispensing everything from ale to opium, and even accidentally introducing terrifying ergot. But now, my friends, as our mind-altering journey through medieval times continues, we must explore the profound societal impacts of these altered states. how they fueled folklore, contributed to historical events like witch hunts, and shaped communal understanding of mental illness and spiritual experiences. Because when the boundaries of perception are constantly shifting, the very fabric of society, its fears and its beliefs are irrevocably altered. So, before you dismiss medieval people as merely superstitious, consider giving a like and subscribing, only of course, if you're ready to uncover how a bad batch of bread could spark a witch hunt, and how visions, whether divine or delirious, shape the very soul of a community. Let me know where you're joining us from. It's always fascinating to see who's out there, connected across the globe. Now, dim the lights. Imagine the hushed, terrified whispers of a village gripped by collective visions. And let's ease into tonight's truly impactful journey together. Prepare yourselves for a world where getting high was never just a personal experience. It was a potent, often terrifying, communal event. Imagine, for a moment, a medieval village. Its life is communal, its resources scarce, and its worldview deeply religious and superstitious. Into this already high-pressure environment, introduce the unpredictable element of altered states of consciousness, whether accidental or intentional. The societal impact was profound and often devastating, particularly when these experiences were widespread or misunderstood. One of the most terrifying and well-documented societal impacts was the direct link between involuntary altered states and witch hunts. To a medieval community, utterly lacking any scientific understanding of mycology or foodborne illness, the sight of neighbours writhing in agony, foaming at the mouth, speaking in tongues, and claiming to see demons or grotesque figures, could only point to one conclusion: demonic possession or witchcraft. This wasn't just individual suffering, it was a communal crisis that fueled paranoia. If several people in a community displayed these symptoms, the fear would quickly escalate. Someone must be to blame. And who better than an outcast, an elderly woman living alone, an eccentric herbalist, or a person with a pre-existing grudge? These harrowing events were not rare. Historical records show clear correlations between ergot outbreaks and spikes in witchcraft accusations and trials, particularly in regions like Salem, Massachusetts, though this was later than the medieval period. The underlying mechanism of misinterpreting ergotism as witchcraft holds true across centuries. The bedmaker, watching a family member succumb to these terrifying symptoms in their bed, would have been gripped by the fear of demonic influence, not tainted grain, perhaps even participating in accusations against a suspected witch. The shared high of ergotism thus became a terrifying, involuntary catalyst for profound social injustice and brutality. Beyond the terror of witch hunts, altered states played a complex role in shaping the medieval understanding of mental illness and spiritual experiences. When a person exhibited signs of profound delirium, speaking incoherently, seeing things that weren't there, or having violent convulsions, symptoms that could arise from ergotism, belladonna poisoning, or even severe fevers, the default interpretation was almost always spiritual. It was rarely seen as a purely physical ailment of the brain. Instead, it was demonic possession, a divine test, or a consequence of sin. Treatments were therefore spiritual, exorcisms, prayers, pilgrimages, or penance rather than medical intervention. The bedmaker caring for such an individual would see themselves as battling evil, not caring for the mentally ill. Conversely, intentional altered states, particularly those achieved through ascetic practices, fasting, sleep deprivation, combined with ritualistic fumes, incense, and intense prayer, were actively encouraged by the Church to induce divine visions and spiritual ecstasy. Monks, hermits, and devout mystics sought these experiences as a direct pathway to God. Imagine a saintly figure experiencing profound, awe-inspiring visions of angels, Christ, or the Virgin Mary, often accompanied by feelings of immense joy and spiritual insight. These were celebrated, canonized, and profoundly influenced medieval art, literature, and theology. The distinction between a divine vision and a drug-induced hallucination, however, was incredibly fine and heavily reliant on the moral character of the individual and the orthodoxy of the vision as judged by church authorities. A visionary experience in a consecrated space by a devout soul was divine. A similar experience by an herbalist on the fringes of society was demonic. The high itself was secondary to its interpretation, highlighting the profound power of cultural and religious frameworks to define reality. Altered states also had a profound impact on social bonding and communal rituals. Alcohol, as we've noted, was central to feasts, festivals, and everyday social interactions. Shared drinking fostered camaraderie, loosened inhibitions, and helped solidify community bonds. These communal highs were vital for releasing tension, celebrating harvests, and marking important life events. Imagine a village feast, everyone slightly tipsy on ale, sharing stories, singing songs, and engaging in boisterous games. It was a crucial safety valve in a world of relentless hardship, allowing for temporary forgetfulness and collective joy. These were the good highs, accepted and woven into the social fabric, even with the understanding that they could sometimes lead to fights or boisterous behaviour. The bedmaker, seeing their lord's servants revelling, would understand this as a necessary, if sometimes rowdy, part of social cohesion. Finally, the medieval experiences of getting high, both accidental and intentional, contributed significantly to the vast body of folklore and myth that permeated everyday life. Tales of fairies leading travellers astray, perhaps a belladonna-induced delirium, all of shape-shifting witches, hallucinations of animal forms, or of encounters with sprites and goblins in the dark woods, fly-agaric visions, all gained credence from the very real, yet inexplicable, altered perceptions people experienced. These stories were not just entertainment, they were explanations for the inexplicable, cautionary tales, and guides for navigating a world teeming with unseen forces. They reinforced the belief in a porous veil between the human and supernatural realms, where a simple mushroom or a piece of bread could literally open a door to another dimension, for better or worse. The high became a narrative device, shaping how people understood their world, its dangers, and its hidden wonders. So, the societal impact of getting high in medieval times was complex, pervasive, and often terrifying. It blurred the lines between medicine and magic, sanity and madness, divine and demonic. It fueled witch hunts, shaped the understanding of mental illness, solidified communal bonds, and contributed richly to the folklore that defined the age. These were not just personal experiences. They were powerful communal events, shaping beliefs, driving actions, and reflecting a society grappling, often brutally, with the profound and unpredictable power of altered consciousness. And that, my friends, is a reality that makes our own pharmaceutical-driven comfort seem like a very recent and very fragile invention. We've delved deep into the societal ripples of medieval highs, exploring how they fueled witch hunts, shaped views on mental illness, and solidified communal bonds. We've seen how profound these experiences were, far from simple recreation. But now, my friends, as our journey through the altered perceptions of the medieval era continues, we must confront a crucial, often overlooked aspect: the ethics, morality, and legal ambiguities surrounding these substances and states. How did a society so deeply steeped in religious doctrine navigate the complex moral maze of mind-altering plants? What constituted acceptable use, and what crossed the line into sin, heresy, or crime? Because in a world where angels and demons were literal, the implications of what you put in your body, or what accidentally entered it, were far more than just physiological. So, before you judge their moral frameworks, or lack thereof, consider giving a like and subscribing. Only, of course, if you're ready to unravel the tangled ethical knots and legal tightropes of medieval consciousness, where intent, outcome, and spiritual interpretation all weighed heavily. Let me know where you're joining us from. It's always fascinating to see who's out there, across the globe, in their own unique moral landscapes. Now, dim the lights, imagine the solemn pronouncements of a bishop, and the terrified confessions of an accused witch, and let's ease into tonight's truly complex journey together. Prepare yourselves for a world where your high could literally cost you your soul. Imagine, for a moment, a society where every action was judged through a spiritual lens, where the concept of a secular drug crime was largely non-existent. Instead, the morality and legality of mind-altering substances revolved heavily around intent and outcome, as interpreted by the Church. Alcohol, as discussed, moderate consumption of ale and wine was generally acceptable, even necessary, as a safer alternative to water. It was viewed as a gift from God. The sin lay in drunkenness, gluttony, the loss of self-control, which led to other sins like violence, lust, or blasphemy. It wasn't the substance itself that was evil, but the abuse of it. Punishments for public drunkenness or associated disorderly conduct would typically be secular, fines, stocks, but the spiritual condemnation was constant. Imagine a peasant aching from a long day, seeking solace in ale. The Church wouldn't condemn the first tankard, but the fifth would earn him a stern lecture, if not worse. Opium, and medicinal use of other potent plants, for therapeutic purposes, to relieve pain, induce sleep, or aid surgery. Opium and other powerful sedatives, even those with hallucinogenic potential in higher doses like belladonna, were generally tolerated, even embraced. Physicians and apothecaries operated under the assumption that they were using God's creation to alleviate suffering. The intent was healing, which was deemed a virtuous act. The high or sedation was a necessary, accepted side effect. However, if the preparation was faulty and led to death, the practitioner could face charges of malpractice or even murder. But the substance itself wasn't condemned per se when used with good intent. Imagine a doctor carefully measuring a poppy draft. His intent was to save, and the spiritual interpretation followed that. The line became incredibly blurred and dangerous when the intent shifted or the outcomes were perceived as unnatural. Sorcery and demonic influence, any substance use or altered state that was not clearly for medicine or sanctioned spiritual practice, immediately fell under suspicion of sorcery, witchcraft, or communion with demons. The Church was absolutely terrified of anything that mimicked spiritual experience, but originated outside its control, viewing such phenomena as direct challenges to its authority and the work of the devil. A wise woman using a hallucinogenic plant to induce visions for divination or a flying ointment was not seen as a medical practitioner, she was a witch, actively conspiring with evil forces. The high itself, especially if it was visionary or brought unusual powers, like prophetic dreams, was seen as demonic power, a gift from Satan, not a chemical reaction. This wasn't just a moral judgment, it was a criminal offence punishable by torture and execution. Imagine the psychological terror of a peasant experiencing a powerful, plant-induced vision, knowing that admitting to it could mean burning at the stake. Unwitting altered states, ergotism. The most morally ambiguous and terrifying cases involved accidental highs like ergotism. As we've discussed, entire communities could experience profound hallucinations and physical torment from contaminated rye bread. Here, the victims were not seen as morally culpable for ingesting the substance. They didn't know it was tainted, but their experience was still almost always interpreted through a spiritual lens. It was divine punishment for communal sins, a test of faith, or a mass demonic possession. While the sick were objects of pity, their hallucinations were real demons, and their suffering a spiritual battle. The Church's response was therefore spiritual: prayers, exorcisms, and sometimes, sadly, the search for a human scapegoat, a witch who might have cursed the grain. The moral ambiguity lay in the cause: innocent victims, yet terrifyingly demonic symptoms, challenging the very fabric of faith. Legal ambiguities and enforcement, formal drug laws as we understand them today, were largely absent. Instead, control was exerted through indirect means: church law, canon law, the Church's moral condemnations of drunkenness, sorcery, and heresy served as powerful legal instruments. ecclesiastical courts could prosecute individuals for these spiritual crimes, leading to excommunication, penance, or being handed over to secular authorities for harsher punishment. Secular law focused more on public order. Drunken brawls, property damage, or violence stemming from alcohol use would be dealt with by local lords or town magistrates through fines, imprisonment, or physical punishment, e.g., the stocks. The sale and quality of ale might also be regulated to ensure fair trade and prevent poisoning, but not primarily for its intoxicating effect. Witchcraft laws. These were the most severe legal instruments used against individuals who cultivated or used psychoactive plants for non-sanctioned purposes. The very act of preparing or administering such plants, if linked to perceived harm or unnatural visions, was evidence of a pact with the devil. These laws were often brutally enforced, especially from the late medieval period into the early modern era. This complex interplay meant that the legal high of medieval times was essentially limited to moderate alcohol consumption and medically sanctioned opium, if you were wealthy enough. Everything else was a perilous gamble with your reputation, your body, and your immortal soul. Imagine the bedmaker, serving a noble who took a poppy draught for pain, silently navigating the ethical tightrope, good intent, accepted medical practice. But if that same bedmaker overheard a wise woman discussing a visionary plant, their moral compass would swing wildly, knowing the dangers of such unholy knowledge. The medieval approach to altered states reveals a society deeply concerned with spiritual purity and communal order, rather than individual autonomy or modern public health. The absence of a scientific framework meant that altered perceptions were interpreted through the most powerful available lens, religion and folklore. This created a world where chemical reactions were divine interventions, where medicine could be magic, and where the simple act of seeking relief or transcendence could be seen as an act of profound heresy. It was a moral minefield, a legal tightrope, and a spiritual battlefield, all wrapped up in the unexpected experiences of getting high. And that, my friends, makes our own contemporary debates about substance use seem, in comparison, rather straightforward and entirely secular. We've navigated the moral minefield of medieval highs, charting the shifting sands of acceptable alcohol consumption versus the terrifying perils of ergot and condemned sorcery. We've seen how profoundly the Church's spiritual interpretations dictated the ethics and legality of altered states. Because while the specific medieval methods of getting high have largely vanished, and thank goodness for that, especially the ergot bread, the fundamental human desires that drove them, for pain relief, spiritual connection, escape, and altered perception remain universally present, manifesting in radically transformed ways in our contemporary world. So, before we bid a final sober farewell to medieval consciousness, consider giving a like and subscribing. Only, of course, if you're ready to see how the past isn't really past, and how our ancestors' desperate quests for altered states still resonate in the most unexpected corners of our modern lives. Let me know where you're joining us from. It's always fascinating to see who's out there, perhaps completely unaware of the long, strange lineage of human consciousness exploration. Now, dim the lights, imagine a bridge stretching across centuries, and let's ease into tonight's final, reflective journey together. Prepare yourselves for the surprising truth that we might be more like our medieval forebears than we think. Imagine, for a moment, the vast chasm between the medieval experience of getting high and our own. Today, we have scientifically formulated medications for pain, anxiety, and sleep. We have recreational substances with known chemical compositions and, in many places, legal frameworks. We understand toxicology, addiction, and the psychological basis of hallucinations. We have designated spaces for consumption and, crucially, emergency services for when things go wrong. For the medieval person, almost none of this existed. Their experience was raw, unpredictable, dangerous, and almost always interpreted through a spiritual, moral, or supernatural lens. However, despite this monumental difference, the fundamental human desires that drove these experiences remain strikingly constant. a deep, persistent thread woven through the tapestry of human history. The quest for pain relief. Today, we have an array of analgesics, from over-the-counter pills to powerful opioids to manage pain. The desire to alleviate physical suffering, to find respite from agony, is a timeless human drive, connecting a medieval peasant taking a poppy draught to a modern patient seeking relief. The desire for escape and solace. Life was brutally hard for most medieval people. Alcohol offered a temporary dulling of senses, a brief respite from the relentless grind. Today, while perhaps more varied and socially nuanced, the human desire for escape from stress, anxiety, or boredom through various means, from alcohol and cannabis to escapist entertainment, remains a powerful, universal impulse. The yearning for spiritual or transcendent experience. Monks sought divine visions through asceticism and incense. Shamans used fly agaric to commune with spirits. This deep-seated human need to connect with something larger than oneself, to transcend ordinary reality, is a powerful driver. Today, while perhaps expressed through different religious practices, meditation, or even certain psychedelic explorations, often in a controlled therapeutic context, the core yearning for spiritual insight or transcendence endures. Social bonding, communal drinking was central to medieval social life. Today, shared meals and drinks, alcoholic or otherwise, still play a vital role in social cohesion and celebration, strengthening bonds within communities. This leads us to a crucial modern echo: the contemporary debates surrounding psychoactive substances. Their legality, their medical use, their recreational role, and their spiritual potential. The medieval period, in its chaotic, unscientific way, grappled with many of the same fundamental questions, albeit without our vocabulary. Medical cannabis and opioid crisis. The medieval use of opium for pain relief, while dangerous, highlights the ancient roots of our struggle to manage pain. Today's opioid crisis is a modern manifestation of the same desire for pain relief, but with pharmaceutical precision and global scale. Similarly, the growing acceptance of medical cannabis reflects a rediscovery of ancient plant knowledge, now interpreted through a scientific lens: psychedelics in therapy. The ritualistic use of hallucinogenic plants and fungi in medieval influence contexts for spiritual insight or healing finds an intriguing parallel in contemporary research into psychedelics, like psilocybin or MDMA, for therapeutic purposes, particularly for conditions like PTSD or depression. The modern quest seeks controlled, beneficial alterations of consciousness, mirroring the medieval spiritual seekers' attempts to find meaning or healing through their visions, albeit with scientific rigor instead of prayers to Saint Anthony. Public health and contamination. The terrifying lesson of ergotism serves as a stark reminder of the critical importance of food safety and public health, a foundation of modern society we often take for granted. It highlights the profound consequences when our sustenance becomes unknowingly toxic, and how a lack of scientific understanding can lead to devastating social and psychological crises, from mass hysteria to witch hunts. The medieval experience of getting high also offers us a unique lens through which to examine our own cultural and moral frameworks. How do we categorize certain substances? What do we deem acceptable versus illicit? What role does intent play in our judgments? The medieval church's nuanced, and sometimes contradictory, views on alcohol versus hallucinogens reflect a similar societal struggle to define boundaries and control behavior, albeit within a vastly different ethical and scientific paradigm. We may no longer attribute visions to demons in our legal systems, but societal stigmas and moral judgments surrounding certain substances persist, demonstrating the enduring power of cultural narrative over purely scientific fact. Finally, the sheer, raw, often terrifying nature of medieval altered states reminds us of humanity's enduring vulnerability and resilience. They face these profound experiences without safety nets, often interpreting them through fear and superstition. Their struggles, their accidental poisons, their desperate quest for relief or transcendence speak to a primal human need to make sense of a confusing, often painful world, and to find meaning or escape where none seems readily available. The anonymous peasant seeking comfort in their weak ale, or the mystic pursuing divine visions through incense, were all, in their own ways, navigating the complex landscapes of consciousness, trying to find their place within a world that was both awe-inspiring and utterly terrifying. So, the unexpected experiences of getting high in medieval times are far more than mere historical curiosities. They are a profound reflection of the human condition, a testament to our timeless desires for pain relief, escape, connection, and spiritual insight. They highlight the dramatic evolution of our scientific understanding, our social norms, and our ethical frameworks. And they ultimately remind us that while the methods have changed, the fundamental human quest to alter perception, for better or for worse, has been a constant, often surprising, thread running through the entire, messy, beautiful, and bewildering tapestry of human history. We've navigated the moral minefield of medieval highs, charting the shifting sands of acceptable alcohol consumption versus the terrifying perils of ergot and condemned sorcery. But now, my friends, as our journey through the altered perceptions of the medieval era deepens further, we must consider how these experiences, both accidental and intentional, didn't just affect individuals. They irrevocably shaped the very narratives, folklore, and understanding of reality that permeated every aspect of medieval life. So, before you dismiss medieval people as merely superstitious, or their stories as quaint fables, consider giving a like and subscribing. Only, of course, if you're ready to uncover how a bad batch of bread could literally create a shared mythology of demons, and how visions, whether divine or delirious, shaped the very soul of a community. Let me know where you're joining us from. It's always fascinating to see who's out there, connected across the globe, perhaps in a world where folklore feels safely distant. Now, dim the lights, imagine the hushed, terrified whispers of a village gripped by collective visions, and let's ease into tonight's truly impactful journey together. Prepare yourselves for a world where getting high was never just a personal experience. It was a potent, often terrifying, communal event that wrote itself into history. Imagine, for a moment, a medieval community gathered around a crackling fire, the only light against the encroaching darkness. Storytelling was not merely entertainment, it was the primary vehicle for transmitting knowledge, history, moral lessons, and, crucially, a way to make sense of a confusing and often terrifying world. Into this oral tradition, the very real experiences of altered states of consciousness, whether induced by disease, plant consumption, or ritual, profoundly injected themselves, creating a rich, often chilling, tapestry of folklore and myth. When people genuinely experienced vivid hallucinations, sensations of flying, or profound delirium, these weren't dismissed as mere psychological phenomena, they were interpreted as tangible, undeniable encounters with the unseen world. Consider the pervasive tales of fairies, goblins, and forest spirits. While these creatures were rooted in older pagan beliefs, their perceived actions and appearances often mirrored the subjective experiences of certain altered states. A traveller, lost and disoriented in the deep woods, might stumble upon a patch of belladonna or henbane, unknowingly ingest its powerful alkaloids, and then experience a terrifying delirium, seeing small, mischievous creatures, hearing disembodied voices, or feeling their body distort. To the medieval mind, these weren't drug-induced hallucinations. They were literal encounters with malicious fairies leading them astray, or malevolent sprites playing tricks. The high became concrete evidence for the existence of these supernatural beings, reinforcing the belief in a porous veil between the human world and a magical, often dangerous, other world. The bedmaker, hearing tales of a lost villager returning with wild stories, would internalize these as proof of fey mischief, not accidental poisoning. Even more terrifying were the stories fueled by ergotism, which, as we've explored, often led to mass hallucinations. Imagine a shared experience across an entire village where people collectively reported seeing demons, grotesque beasts, or suffering visions of hellfire. For a deeply religious society, this wasn't a medical anomaly, It was a profound religious experience, albeit a terrifying one, interpreted as a direct manifestation of God's wrath, or more often, a mass demonic possession. These communal bad trips could lead to fervent religious revivals, desperate communal prayers, and, tragically, a frantic search for earthly causes, which often led to the brutal phenomenon of witch hunts. Accused witches, under torture, might confess to flying through the air, shape-shifting into animals, or having carnal relations with the devil, confessions that eerily align with the known hallucinatory effects of certain tropane alkaloids found in belladonna, henbane, etc., and the disorienting, out-of-body sensations some psychoactive substances could induce. The line between true demonic pact and a medically induced hallucination was simply non-existent. The experience was the proof. These stories, born from genuine altered states, solidified a terrifying mythology that influenced legal proceedings, social paranoia, and the grim fates of countless innocent individuals. This constant blurring of subjective experience with objective reality profoundly shaped the medieval understanding of truth and evidence. In an age without scientific method, personal testimony, dreams, and visions often held immense weight, particularly if they were perceived as divinely inspired. A prophet's vision, a saint's ecstatic trance, perhaps unintentionally aided by ascetic practices and incense, or a devout mystic's communion with God, were all taken as literal truth, direct messages from the heavens. These divine highs became foundational elements of religious narratives, inspiring art, literature, and the very doctrines of the Church. Imagine how a vivid, psilocybin-like vision, from fly agaric perhaps, in a pagan context, might have been interpreted as a profound spiritual journey by some, or a demonic encounter by others, depending on the interpreter's belief system and the social context. The bedmaker, observing a noble claiming a divine vision, would treat it with utmost reverence, not suspicion, further solidifying its perceived reality. Beyond the terrifying and the divine, altered states also provided a crucial outlet for social commentary and imaginative release. Alcohol-fueled gatherings, particularly during festivals, allowed for a temporary loosening of social strictures. People might engage in boisterous satire, tell bawdy jokes, or even voice grievances against their lords or the church that would be unthinkable in sober moments. The high provided a temporary shield, an excuse for transgression, before the sober realities of hierarchy and control reasserted themselves. These were moments of collective imaginative escape, where the harshness of daily life could be temporarily forgotten, and the human need for release, for humour, and for challenging authority could find a fleeting, if volatile, expression. These shared experiences, recorded in popular songs, satirical poems, or just passed down orally, added another layer to the medieval psyche, a recognition that sometimes you just needed to get a little bit out of your head to cope. Finally, the medieval experiences of getting high, and the stories they spawned, profoundly influenced how society perceived and dealt with mental illness and unusual behaviour. As we've seen, delirium, psychosis, and severe personality changes, symptoms of ergotism or toxic plant poisoning, or even just severe fever, were rarely attributed to physical ailments. Instead, they were almost universally interpreted as demonic possession, a curse, or a moral failing. The person experiencing these terrifying states was not a patient. They were an object of fear, pity, or judgment. This misinterpretation led to tragic treatments, ranging from exorcisms and prayers to chaining, brutal beatings, and even execution. The high, in these cases, stripped away a person's humanity, reducing them to a vessel for evil, profoundly impacting their identity and fate. The bedmaker, caring for someone in such a state, would see not a sick person, but a spiritual battle unfolding in their bed, responding with fear and prayers rather than medicine. So, the cumulative impact of these surprising experiences of getting high in medieval times was nothing short of monumental. They weren't just personal trips, they were powerful cultural phenomena that fueled folklore, shaped religious beliefs, exacerbated social paranoia into witch hunts, influenced the understanding of mental illness, and provided crucial outlets for communal bonding and imaginative release. They irrevocably altered the medieval understanding of reality, creating a world where the boundaries of perception were constantly shifting, and every vision, every altered state was imbued with profound, often terrifying meaning. And that, my friends, is a reality that makes us truly appreciate our scientific understanding of the brain, our safe entertainment, and our ability to distinguish between a bad dream and a demonic visitation. We've peeled back the layers of medieval social norms and moral judgments surrounding altered states, understanding how ale was tolerated, opium was a feared medicine, and ergot a terrifying accident attributed to divine wrath or demonic mischief. We've even considered the cautious whispers around cannabis and ritualistic fumes, and explored the intricate ethical and legal ambiguities that govern these profound experiences. We've seen how impactful these encounters were, far from simple recreation. We then delved into how these accidental and intentional altered states irrevocably shaped the very narratives, folklore, and understanding of reality that permeated every aspect of medieval life, from fairy tales to witch hunts. We're here to look at the cumulative impact of these surprising experiences, their profound influence on the medieval psyche, and the enduring lessons they hold for our modern world, particularly concerning human resilience, the nature of belief, and our ongoing, complex relationship with consciousness, altering substances. So, before we bid a final, sober farewell to medieval consciousness, and perhaps pour a very, very carefully sourced, non-ergot tainted beverage, consider giving a truly heartfelt like and subscribing. Only, of course, if you're ready to see how deeply the past is woven into our present, and how our ancestors' desperate quests for altered states still resonate in the most unexpected corners of our modern lives. Let me know where you're joining us from. It's always fascinating to see who's out there, across the globe, perhaps completely unaware of the long, strange lineage of human consciousness exploration. Now, dim the lights one last time. Imagine a shimmering, ethereal bridge stretching across centuries, connecting their fears and desires to our own. And let's ease into tonight's final, reflective, and longest journey together. Prepare yourselves for the surprising truth that, despite all our advancements, we might be more like our medieval forebears than we comfortably admit, just with better plumbing and, crucially, significantly less demon-haunted bread. Imagine, for a final, encompassing moment, the vast, almost incomprehensible chasm between the medieval experience of getting high and our own contemporary reality. Today, we exist in a world where pharmaceutical science has revolutionized pain management, anxiety relief, and sleep induction, offering predictable, controlled, and mostly safe options. We navigate a landscape of recreational substances that, while carrying their own risks, often come with known chemical compositions, predictable, or at least somewhat understood effects, and, in many places, established legal frameworks for their use. We possess a basic understanding of toxicology, the mechanisms of addiction, and the psychological basis of hallucinations. Crucially, we have designated spaces for consumption and, most importantly, emergency services and medical professionals on standby for when things go profoundly wrong. For the medieval person, almost none of this existed. Their experience was raw, unpredictable, terrifyingly dangerous, and almost universally interpreted through a spiritual, moral, or supernatural lens. There was no scientific explanation. For a vision, it was either divine intervention or demonic torment. There was no addiction treatment. There was moral condemnation, ostracization, and often an unavoidable descent into destitution, a fate indistinguishable from a curse. However, despite this monumental, almost unimaginable difference in context and understanding, the fundamental human desires and needs that drove these experiences remain strikingly constant, a deep, persistent thread woven through the entire complex tapestry of human history. This is perhaps the most profound and humbling lesson these surprising experiences offer us: the universal quest for pain relief. In an era where suffering was an almost ubiquitous companion, where chronic aches from relentless labor, battle wounds, and sudden agonizing injuries were simply facts of life, opium was nothing short of a divine blessing. It represented the peak of available pharmacology, a powerful balm against unimaginable agony. Today, we have an unparalleled array of analgesics, from over-the-counter pills to sophisticated pharmaceutical opioids, to manage every conceivable degree of pain. The desire to alleviate physical suffering, to find respite from agony, to simply not hurt, is a timeless, primal, human drive, connecting a medieval peasant taking a carefully guarded poppy draught to a modern patient seeking relief from chronic illness. The specific tools and understanding change dramatically, but the inherent human need remains fiercely consistent. The deep-seated desire for escape and solace, life for most medieval people, was brutally hard, relentlessly demanding, and often tragically short. Today, while perhaps expressed through more varied means and within different social rituals, from alcohol and cannabis to escapist entertainment, virtual realities, and even compulsive online activity, the human desire for escape from stress, anxiety, boredom, or trauma remains a powerful, universal impulse. It's the constant human need for a temporary vacation from reality, however fleeting or imperfect. The enduring yearning for spiritual or transcendent experience. Monks, hermits, and devout mystics consciously sought divine visions and spiritual ecstasy through rigorous ascetic practices, fasting, sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, combined with ritualistic fumes like frankincense. Shamans and cunning folk in more pagan-influenced regions used plants like fly agaric to commune with spirits or interpret the unseen world. This deep-seated human need to connect with something larger than oneself, to transcend ordinary, mundane reality, to glimpse the divine or the otherworldly, is a powerful, persistent driver of human behavior. Today, while perhaps expressed through different religious practices, meditation, mindfulness, or even controlled therapeutic explorations with psychedelics, often in a clinical context, the core yearning for spiritual insight, profound meaning, or transcendence endures. The methods have evolved from burning herbs to precisely dosed compounds, but the human spirit's reach for the ineffable is truly timeless. The fundamental role of social bonding, communal drinking, was absolutely central to medieval social life, facilitating feasts, festivals, celebrations, and everyday interactions. Shared intoxication fostered camaraderie, loosened inhibitions, and helped solidify community bonds in a tightly knit, often interdependent world. Today, shared meals and drinks, alcoholic or otherwise, still play a vital role in social cohesion, celebration, and ritual, strengthening bonds within families, friendships, and broader communities. The social glue, provided by altered states, particularly alcohol, remains a constant, if evolving, feature of human interaction across all cultures and eras. This leads us to a crucial modern echo and the enduring lessons these medieval experiences offer. The contemporary debates surrounding psychoactive substances, their legality, their appropriate medical use, their recreational role, and their spiritual potential. The medieval period, in its chaotic, unscientific, and often brutal way, grappled with many of the same fundamental questions, albeit without our modern vocabulary or ethical frameworks. The opioid crisis and medical cannabis. The medieval use of opium for profound pain relief, while dangerous and poorly understood, highlights the ancient roots of our ongoing struggle to manage human suffering. Today's opioid crisis is a tragically modern manifestation of the same powerful human desire for pain relief, but operating with pharmaceutical precision and on a global industrial scale. We face similar ethical dilemmas about access, control, and the societal cost of these potent compounds. Similarly, the growing reacceptance of medical cannabis in many parts of the world reflects a rediscovery and re-evaluation of ancient plant knowledge, now interpreted through a scientific lens of efficacy, safety, and harm reduction. Psychedelics in therapy and spiritual practice. the ritualistic use of hallucinogenic plants and fungi in medieval, influenced contexts for spiritual insight or healing finds an intriguing, if cautious, parallel in contemporary scientific research into the therapeutic potential of psychedelics, like psilocybin, MDMA, or ayahuasca, for conditions such as PTSD, depression, and end-of-life anxiety. The modern quest seeks controlled, beneficial alterations of consciousness for healing and insight, mirroring the medieval spiritual seekers' attempts to find meaning, solace, or healing through their visions, albeit with scientific rigor, psychological understanding, and ethical guidelines. Rather than prayers to St. Anthony for protection from demons, the human yearning for altered states for growth, not just escape, persists, but now with a vastly expanded toolkit and understanding. Public health, food safety, and accidental contamination. The terrifying, widespread lesson of ergotism serves as a stark, visceral reminder of the critical importance of food safety, public health infrastructure, and scientific literacy foundations of modern society that we often take for granted. It highlights the profound and devastating consequences when our sustenance becomes unknowingly toxic, and how a lack of scientific understanding can lead to catastrophic social and psychological crises, from mass hysteria and dancing manias to brutal witch hunts and profound social injustice. It's a sobering testament to how profoundly our physical environment shapes our mental states and societal beliefs, even when the cause is utterly invisible. The medieval experience of getting high also offers us a unique, humbling lens through which to examine our own cultural and moral frameworks. How do we categorize certain substances? What role does intent play in our judgments, and how much does scientific understanding, or the lack thereof, truly influence our moral stances? The medieval church's nuanced, and sometimes wildly contradictory, views on alcohol versus hallucinogens, or on divine visions versus demonic possession, reflect a similar, ongoing societal struggle to define boundaries, control behavior, and interpret reality. We may no longer attribute visions to demons in our legal systems, but societal stigmas, moral judgments, and profound cultural narratives surrounding certain substances persist, demonstrating the enduring power of collective belief over purely scientific fact, even in our enlightened age. Finally, the sheer, raw, often terrifying nature of medieval altered states reminds us of humanity's enduring vulnerability and extraordinary resilience. They faced these profound experiences, accidental poisons, terrifying delirium, desperate quests for relief or transcendence, without the safety nets, the scientific explanations, or the support systems we possess. Yet, the anonymous peasant seeking comfort in their weak ale, the cunning herbalist carefully preparing a poppy draught, or the mystic pursuing divine visions through incense, filled rituals were all, in their own ways, navigating the complex landscapes of consciousness, trying to find their place within a world that was both awe-inspiring and utterly terrifying. Their experiences, though profoundly different in context, echo our own human story. A ceaseless exploration of the mind, a relentless pursuit of comfort and meaning, and a surprising capacity to adapt and survive, even in the most bewildering of altered realities. And that, my friends, is a reality that makes us truly appreciate our clean, predictable, and mostly demon-free modern world, and the long, strange, mind-bending journey it took to get here, a journey that continues to unfold, one altered state at a time, for better or for worse.